Father, each of us faces our own problems. Some of them are enormous, some of them are smaller, but no problem that you allow to come into our lives is small for us, for they are matters in which we must learn to trust you. So, Father, sustain us in such times and let us find you completely sufficient for all of our needs. You are sufficient, but we haven't come to know your sufficiency, and thus we have a hard time trusting you. Thank you that you know our weakness, that you are not ashamed of us, that you take joy in the work that you are doing through Jesus and through your Spirit in our lives. So grant us the privilege of learning to know you, to trust in your sufficiency, and to rely on you for every need that we have. For Jesus' sake we pray.
Amen. Amen. Thank
Well,
you.
good morning, evening to you. Good morning here. It's 9:30 in the morning here in Memphis, Tennessee, and it's good to be with you. We're continuing in our studies, and I did look back just now, Brother Tim, and saw that it is the third week. I thought it was the fourth, but it is the third week. We have 2 more weeks. In some measure, I've rushed through some of this material because I thought we were getting toward the end of our study, so I have not done everything that I might have done otherwise. But we're still working on our Christology study, and in the process of doing that, we've been using the PowerPoint. Let me get it where I want it to be. Did I cancel my connection? Someone speak to me? I think I did.
We can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me. All right, well, yay. I thought maybe I had canceled my connection online. So you're seeing now the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit from last week, and we talked about this over a couple of periods. There we said that this act is unpardonable because the one thing that is absolutely certain about the miracles of Jesus is that they are done by God. That he is a man is more obvious. That he is God is not so obvious. So that the power who is at work in him is not his own power. It is the work of the Holy Spirit who is working in him. And so to blaspheme the Spirit is unpardonable, not only in this age, but in the age to come. Thus, Jesus can say that all men may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. And so we were last week discussing this great problem. What does it mean when it says that the Son cannot do anything on his own? And the answer I give is the one we've just intimated from Matthew 12, and that is, he does nothing by his own power. This is what we've been saying about the incarnation. During the incarnation, Jesus limited what could be revealed of his nature to what could be revealed through a human form. And omnipresence cannot be, so he says in the Upper Room Discourse, it is good for you that I go away. He will not reveal, during the incarnation, he will not reveal himself omnipresently to all of his disciples. He has determined not to do that. So only in his glorification can he be with all of his disciples wherever they are. And here we are sitting 8,000 miles apart via airplane. And in those 8,000 miles, there is nowhere, supposing that along the arc on the globe, there were people in this audience on every point of the arc. The Son now will reveal his presence to them all along that arc of 8,000 miles going all the way around the world. He is revealing himself to all of them. If he had remained in the incarnation, he would have revealed only what could be revealed through the human form. So he would have been locally limited during that time. He is still God, but he reveals himself not as God in the incarnation. He reveals himself as man, and he reveals himself in his divine attributes only to the extent that they must be revealed, namely righteousness and compassion and grace. Those things he can reveal through the divine nature, but omnipresence and omnipotence he cannot reveal. He will not reveal. So he says, John 5:19, the Son cannot do anything on his own. He doesn't know who touched him in the crowd, which is remarkable. We looked at these matters last week. How does he not know? Is he not omnipotent? And once again, as we said last week, the Son's mind is a true human mind. And as a true human mind is limited in its capacities, so the mind of Jesus is limited in its capacities. My mind is limited by sin and by my natural human condition. Jesus has no limitation from sin, and we'll address the issue of Jesus and sinfulness shortly. But he has no limitation in his mind because of the fallen human mind, but his mind is still limited in its capacity to hold ideas. So there are things he does not know. And specifically in this passage, he does not know who touched him in a crowd. And furthermore, the Son does not know the day of his return. Concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Well, how is it that he doesn't know the day of his own return? Because he's a human, and he knows only what the Father reveals to him. Indeed, let me go back to the previous slide, John 5:19. He cannot do anything on his own, only what he sees the Father doing, that he does. We read in John 5 and following. The point is in Matthew 24:36, the Father has not revealed the date of his return to his human mind. In the resurrection, he now knows. But in the incarnation, in those years, from birth to adulthood, he does not know the day of his own return. I have mentioned a theologian to you on several occasions up to this point. Let me come back and how do I get out of this now? Here we are. I have mentioned a theologian to you on several occasions up to this point. His name is William G.T. Shedd. He was a great theologian in the late 19th century. Shedd made the point.
Dr. Allman, can you share your screen?
Are you seeing my face?
Yes.
I want you to see my face right now.
Right now, yes. Then that's fine.
I'm sorry. I know my face is a problem. My mother used to say, "Here you are in this room." How did she say it? With your teeth in your mouth and your bare face hanging out. And so my bare face is hanging out today. Let's see. I was referring to specifically the issues of the human nature. And the knowledge of Jesus. I'm sorry, I've forgotten what Shedd was saying, but let me go back to the PowerPoint now because we lost the connection to it a while ago. We'll go back to it here. For all the wonder of the human mind, it is still finite. We have not yet taxed the storage capacity of the human mind. That simply, we don't know how much the human mind can retain. I mentioned to you last week, I remember, I'm 72 years old. I remember a telephone number that we had before I was 6. So 66 years ago, Trinity 88710. Why I remember that date, I have no, telephone number, I have no idea. We used words and numbers back in those days. We've gone all to numbers altogether now in America. We're much more like India in that respect. But why should I remember that? Well, in part because my parents drilled it into me. They wanted me to be able to go any place and get help at any point just by telling someone my name and my parents' name and my phone number, and they could call and get me help. I remember things that I learned 56 years ago. Why? What use are they now to me? When I was studying in 9th grade, you would call it 9th standard. When I was studying in my first year Latin course, and I remember the paradigms from that course. Why? I have no reason to need them. They don't function for me anymore. I still work with Latin these days, but I don't need that memory of those matters. I remember things from 50 years ago when I was in the Army, and I had dialogues 4 days a week. And I remember, as I think I recited for you, the dialogue from 50 years ago. Why would I remember that? There's no particular need I have for that, but I remember it. We have not yet taxed the wonder of the human mind. We don't even get close to taxing its capacity for recall and combination of ideas. We have not even begun to tax it. But there are two problems. My human mind is finite. Jesus' human mind is finite. My other problem, though, he does not share. My problem is I still have the effects of sin in my life, and that means in my mind and my thinking, so that my mind is still in need of renewal, as Paul told the Romans, by the renewing of your minds. So be transformed. And by the renewing of your minds, we need to think more biblically. And that's why we do these studies. Every theological study that we do, every biblical study that we do, aims at the renewing of our minds. Jesus needed no renewing of his mind. He was able to use, and I'm saying more than I understand. If you were to ask me a question about this, I would have no answer for it, but I'm convinced of its truth. Jesus was able to use the full capacity of the human mind because he had no sin. So the Son cannot, not because he has inherent inability, but because he has chosen to live as a true human being among human beings. So his mind is not infinite. It has its limits, and individually, so just as in the human mind, our mind in its capacities varies from person to person. So in Jesus' mind, there is more to his mind than to ours. To be a true human, Jesus must have a true human mind as he has a true human will. You will say, does he not have entirely the will of the Father? And the answer is no. And you have at your disposal, in your memory, evidence to the contrary of that. You know this, and it's very important to us. This season of the year, we have even celebrated it in some measure. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed, "Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." Jesus had a true human mind and a true human will. his true human mind is able to think things differently from the Father, and his true human will is able to will things contrary to what the Father wills. But he subjects himself entirely to his Father, and thus he even, as my favorite professor would have said, he flogged his own will into compliance with the Father's will in the Garden of Eden, so that, Garden of Gethsemane, so that he would face the hour that was coming upon him, the cup that he must drink. He will take it for all the horror that that cup entailed. And what is strange, beyond capacity to understand, this is not in the notes on the PowerPoint at all, but what is strange beyond my capacity to understand is his outcry on the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me? And if you ask me what that means, I do not know, I cannot comprehend. This may be the essence and the real mystery of the atonement. It is not the physical death of Jesus that is the mystery of the atonement. The physical death of Jesus is the cessation of the operation of his human body. But it is not a cessation of Jesus. As we all believe, the death of a human is the separation of the human spirit from the human body. But something happened on the cross. What it is, I do not know. I have colleagues that say that Jesus was never abandoned by the Father. I cannot go there. It seems to be, as is customary in English to describe it, the cry of dereliction. He is a derelict. He is abandoned by the one resource that was essential to his life, and that was his Father. I do not know what it means. May never know what it means. But that outcry on the cross, he did, and I would link this to Hebrews 5, with strong cryings and tears. He pleaded with him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his godliness. So this one, Jesus, underwent a separation that the Word never knew. The Word never knew division from the God. And I'm calling upon you to remember what we have discussed in the last 2 weeks, that the God, the Word, and the Spirit are parallel terms. Father, Son, and Spirit are not parallel terms. Father and Son are parallel terms, but the Spirit is not parallel to the Father and the Son. So I'm arguing in this study that the God, the Word, and the Spirit are the three persons of the Trinity as they have existed from eternity. Father is an is an economic term that is applicable to the God once he has engendered the person of the body of Jesus in the womb of the Virgin Mary. And so Jesus may rightly be called Son, but not Son in eternity. The one who is the Son is eternal, but his title is a reference to his coming in the incarnation. So Jesus has a true human mind as he has a true human will. And it's important for us to understand this. He struggled with the will of his Father as you and I struggle with the will of our Father. He had no rebellion in his being. We have rebellion in our being. But he struggled with the will of his Father because of the terror of the atonement. You and I struggle with the will of the Father because of at least two things. One of them that is right and proper that we should do. The other is more sinful. The one that's more sinful is we struggle because we have our own plans that we are telling God, these are the things we want you to bless. These are the works we want to accomplish. Here, God, is my gift to you. You must bless this gift, and I will trust you as you bless this gift. And when he says, no, I have something different for you, we hear, no, I have something far worse, and it's going to be miserable for you, and you're going to hate every minute of it. Because we don't have the mind of God. We are gaining it, we're learning it. But we are people who have our own goals, our own longings, our own desires, our own will. We anticipate, we assume that God's purpose is to grant us our will. But his purpose is to do for us something far greater than we can even dream. This is why Jesus submitted his will in the Garden of Gethsemane to the will of his Father, because his suffering, Paul will say something like this in 2 Corinthians. Our lightness, in fact, it's even, I love it. In the King James, he says, our light affliction. In Greek, it is our present lightness of affliction is working for us a far exceeding weight of glory. Whatever affliction we undergo, when compared to what Jesus suffered in the incarnation, both in his horror at our sinfulness and our filth, but more importantly, his horror at bearing the wrath of God on the cross. His affliction is so far beyond ours that Paul can say our present lightness of affliction is working for us a far exceeding weight of glory. So God knows what he's doing for us, and he knows, and I learned this, I watched Jesus, I can learn this. He knows what he's doing for us, and he knows that if we will go through what he has planned for us, hard as it may be, painful as it may be, sorrowful as it may be, there is a future weight of glory that far exceeds any suffering we may undergo. And when we stand before the throne, and when we experience the judgment seat of Christ, the effect of that is going to be, brothers and sisters, you must understand this. It is essential that you do. You must understand that you will be shocked at the generosity of God's gift, how great it is and how marvelous it is. There's an old song that we used to sing. I didn't learn it until my early adulthood, but it's an old song that's been around America for a long time. I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver and a little gold. But in that, now I can't remember the words, in that mansion where the ransom will shine, I've got a gold one that's silver lined. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop in that bright land where we'll never grow old, and someday yonder we will never more wander, but walk on streets that are purest gold. I've got a mansion, brothers and sisters. I don't know what that means, but the reward that awaits you is a reward that is given by the grace of God for us, so that whatever reward he has planned for you is so perfectly adapted to you, and being free of sin finally, for the first time in our experience, the reward that is yours, that awaits you in heaven, is so great that you could not possibly envy anybody else's gift. I can say that because I know what God has done for Jesus. So in Philippians 2, wherefore God also has highly exalted him and and lavished upon him the name that's above every name. And we talked about this 2 weeks ago. The name that's above every name is not the name Jesus. The name that's above every name is what Paul says shortly after that statement in Philippians 2. Every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. He will grant to Jesus the answer to the prayer that Jesus prayed in John 17. Glorify me with the glory that I had before the foundation of the world. And I want, Father, that those whom you have given me shall be with me and shall see my glory. And we will all see Jesus in his glory. And we will be driven to our faces because of the majesty and splendor that belongs to Jesus. This is our future. This is our lot. And the incarnation is the root to it. In the incarnation, Jesus took upon himself the form of a servant. He didn't just come in form as a servant. The word for form of a servant is the same word as the word for form of God. So if he is fully and truly God, he was fully and truly a servant. And he took that full reality upon himself, lived in it for 30 plus years, died a horrific death, raised gloriously in a glorified body. And we'll look at this more as we go. So we are in the middle of talking about Christology with reference especially to the humanity of Jesus. And it's essential that we do this. In a couple of weeks, we will talk about why this study is so important. But here, I hope you begin to see there is something to the incarnation that will feed the human soul. It is essential for us to know Jesus struggled the way I struggle. Now back to our PowerPoint. And so we've just been saying to be a true human, Jesus must have a true human mind as he has a true human will. And the effect of that, his prayer in the garden, not my will, but yours be done, his will differs from the Father. As a man, his will differs from the Father. As God, his will cannot differ from the Father. So how can his will differ except that he has a true human will? If he were God only, his will could never differ from the Father's because he has the mind of God. He is a true man with a true human mind, true human will. Someone's on with the microphone still on. So if you check, all of you, your mic and turn it off, that will be helpful to the whole group. Thank you for doing that. Now we take up a very controverted issue, the impeccability of Christ. Addresses the issue whether and to what extent Christ was able or unable to sin. There are various views on this subject. One view holds that Jesus was able not to sin. I'm going to get real specific in word order here in English, and this may not be as clear to you for whom many of you, English is a first language, but not American English and not necessarily technical English. But one view holds that Jesus was able not to sin. That is, he had the ability to sin, but he also had the ability to keep himself from sinning. Those who hold this view find it difficult to understand how Jesus could be tempted if he was not able to sin. Another view, so B here, holds that he was not able to sin. And a third view holds, both views agree that he was tempted and that he did not sin, but how could the temptations have been real if he could not have sinned? So these important questions are addressed. In Hebrews 4:15, we have an important contribution to it. Let's turn there. Let's see, I have my Bible, here it is. Hebrews 4:15. The Greek text here is a little bit difficult, and so I'm reading from an English text. I can make sense out of the Hebrews 4:15 in Greek, but here I want to solve some of the problems that are present in the Greek text. We do not have a high priest who is unable. By the way, do we have a high priest today? Somebody answer that verbally, orally. Turn on your mic and say, do we have a high priest today? Is it yes or no?
Yes.
You're
In
sure?
heaven.
You're sure we have a high priest?
Yes.
Yes.
In heaven.
Well, that's problematic. So we'll come back to that later. So go ahead and mute yourselves again. But in 4:15, we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. But we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Jesus was tempted in every way, just as we are. Was he tempted to run over somebody in a car? Well, the answer is no. He didn't have cars. They didn't have cars in his day. And he was so poor, he didn't have a car anyway. He was a villager. He was a tribal from the Roman point of view. And so he was very poor and struggled even with the means of daily life. So here he is, never having a car, never even having a horse or a cart or a bullock cart. So how can Hebrews say he was tempted in every way like we are, yet without sin? The answer is he was never tempted. I'm sorry, he was tempted, no doubt, to take somebody's life. He was tempted to break the law. He was tempted in every way that humans are tempted. But he didn't sin. So what are we to make of this? First, what the verse does not say, that he was tempted with a view to succumbing to sin. The text does not say that he was able to sin. It just says that he was tempted in every way that we are, but without sin. The text says that he was tempted and he did not sin. B, it does not say that he was tested in every particular specific test that man can be put to. It does say his tests were in all the areas in which man can be tested. I've wondered and puzzled over this. I'm not really puzzling, but it occurred to me after I had children that Jesus went through some peculiar tests. All of us go through if we have siblings. I'm an only child, and so I never had a brother or a sister to grow up with, and so never had to face the issues that Jesus had to face. He has brothers and sisters, all of whom are sinful. You will remember in John chapter 7 that his brothers did not believe in him until after the resurrection. And so, let me just take a sidestep here. The essential element of sin is unbelief. It is not disobedience. We have a definition that comes from 1 John. All sin is lawlessness. And so we think that that's a definition. It's a description. It's not a definition because it doesn't cover all sin. Romans chapter 5 makes it clear that from Adam to Moses, there was no law. So if there's no law, sin cannot be accounted. It doesn't have the characteristic of transgression. As a result, where there is no law, you can't be held accountable for your sin. So if all sin is lawlessness, and yet there was a time when the human race didn't have law, then from Paul's point of view, there could have been no sin in human life. So what is sin? John 16:8-9, we probably have referred to before in our studies. John 16:8-9, talking about the coming of the Holy Spirit. He, when he comes, will convict the word convict doesn't mean to make them feel bad about. It means what it means in court. When you convict a defendant at court, he is shown to be guilty. So let me read it that way. He, when he comes, will show the world to be guilty in respect of righteousness, of sin, of righteousness, and of judgment. And then he gives us the evidence that will convict the world of sin because they do not believe in me. The Pharisees, as far as their lights led them, were obedient to the law of God. They were obedient and sinful. In their obedience, they were sinful. Because, as we've, I think, pointed out in recent weeks, Paul could say, as far as the righteousness which is by the law is concerned, I was blameless. So did Saul of Tarsus, before his conversion, love God with all his heart, soul, and strength. And people here in Memphis, Tennessee said to me 20 years ago and more, yes, he loved God with all his heart, soul, and strength. Then Saul of Tarsus John, the apostle, was confused, and so was Jesus, whom John quoted when he said, if you had known the Father, you would have known me. Whoever honors the Father must honor the Son. Saul of Tarsus is not honoring the Son, he's persecuting the Son, which means that he's persecuting God the Father. He has no love for God. His love is for his own personal righteousness, not for the law of God or for God himself. So the issue for us is Jesus was tempted not to trust. And you know that because you know the three passages, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where the temptation of Jesus is recorded. And in each case, Satan's enticement to Jesus is to cease trusting the Father. You're out here 40 days with no food. Command these stones to be made bread. You have that authority. But he intends to live in his incarnation entirely in dependence on God. So he is tempted consistently not to trust God, but to act on his own. But throughout his entire incarnation, from his first moments in the cradle to his last moments on the cross, he is tempted to act on his own authority. Hear, as you surely are in your mind, the words of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He trusted God. Let God deliver him if he takes pleasure in him. Hear the words of the criminal on the cross. If you are the Son of God, take yourself and us down from the cross. He is tempted to live by his own will and not by the will of the Father. But that would not be life as a true human being. So he lives his entire life, trusting entirely in the will of the Father, doing always the will of the Father. So this, on our screen here, point 2a, what the verse does not say is that he was tempted with a view to succumbing to sin. 2b, it does not say that he was tested in every particular specific test that man can be put to. It does say that his tests were in all the areas in which a man is tested. Can you imagine being a younger brother of Jesus? In the same household, growing up with the same parents, and hearing his mother say, why can't you be more like Jesus? And the answer is, well, I've got to do a little play acting here, so I'm going to go back to why can't you be more like your big brother Jesus? Well, he's God, and I'm not. They didn't know that, and they didn't believe it. But how could you ever compete with Jesus in school, in the carpenter's, well, he wasn't a carpenter, he was probably a stonemason, but in the shop, how could you ever compete with Jesus? His body is completely under the control of his will. How can you ever compete with Jesus? And you have to grow up like that. What kinds of things did his brothers do to him to get him into trouble? I'm convinced that Jesus took a beating from his father because that was what Proverbs taught. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, and the rod of discipline will drive it far from him. So I may say that, by the way, with you in India, because beating is the same as our word spanking, which is not a beating in America. A beating in America is abusive, and we would go to court. In fact, you can go to court for spanking your child now in America, which is part of our problem. Discipline is lacking in the home. But the point is that when the brothers got Jesus into trouble, I'm convinced that Joseph spanked Jesus, beat him, not because he deserved it, but because his brothers put him in a position where it looked like Jesus was completely in the wrong. That's what brothers and sisters do, isn't it? So I being an only child, I've only seen that with my own children. I had to learn that from watching my children grow up, but I didn't learn it from my own experience. So the issue is that Jesus is tempted in every respect that a human can be tempted. I'm confident you know this. You know this. You haven't thought about the implications of it. I am confident that Jesus was propositioned by a prostitute. I want you to remember that one of the problems that the Pharisees had with Jesus was that he was a friend of publicans and sinners. Well, prostitutes admired Jesus. They followed him. They don't follow us. Why don't they follow us? Because they don't believe that we love them. They were convinced he loved them. And I'm convinced that one or more of them came to him and offered herself to Jesus on perhaps many occasions. But Jesus would have been brokenhearted that they would think that he might be interested. And second, brokenhearted over their brokenness in sin. And they didn't see in his eyes rejection and hatred and spite. They saw in his eyes love and compassion as he turned them down. And I'm equally convinced that no prostitute ever propositioned him twice, because they knew that he really loved them. And they had never experienced love, not like that before, just as you and I have not experienced such love before. So he was tested in every way, but without sin. Back to our PowerPoint. Now, to see, the phrase according to likeness apparently means that he could be tested because he took the likeness of sinful flesh. And then fourth, apart from sin, means that having no sin nature, he could not have been tested from that avenue. I have a sin nature. I don't like the term sin nature. What I prefer is to just go with what the Holy Spirit inspired Paul to use, the word flesh. I have flesh. Jesus didn't have flesh. If that's a confusing statement to you, turn in your Bible to Romans chapter 7. In Romans 7, there is a fundamental statement about flesh that you need to understand. And if you have one of the more modern translations, it will not be very clear. I'm reading here from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, and it does pretty well with it. Verse 5, Romans 7:5 is on page 153 of the New Testament, if that helps you. And that's supposed to be a joke, so I can't hear you laughing or watch your faces. So I hope you're smiling at my joke. Verse 5, while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit to death. There are three things in that statement that you need to notice. First, when we were living in the flesh. What does were living mean? In English, that's a statement that I would make when I am saying I no longer do that. So I may say about my wife and me, when we were living in Dallas, this is what we did. We now live in Memphis. We don't live in Dallas anymore. So when we were living in the flesh, is something we now do not do. But there are two more statements about flesh in this verse. One is our sinful passions. In my flesh and in yours, there are sinful passions. The word passion is a word which in modern American English has to do primarily with sexual interests. This is a word in Greek, though, that can be used that way, but it has many other meanings, and it's used in Galatians chapter 6, to refer to cravings. Craving is something more strong than an appetite, an interest you have. It's much stronger than that. What you crave, you tend to do what you have to satisfy. So right now I'm craving a drink of water. I cannot leave right now to get a drink of water to do that, but I'm craving it. It will get worse as the moments go on. But the larger issue is the flesh of a human being, a mere human being, has sinful cravings, sinful passions. The flesh of Jesus had no such thing. And then third, you will see in verse 5, the reference that they were aroused by the law. Flesh has in it a capacity to long to live by some external standard by which to gain honor, by which to gain reward. You put those three things together, living in the flesh, passions of sin or sinful cravings, and law, and you get what Romans 7:5 says, produced acts of sin. It produced fruit for the flesh. We are not now living in the flesh, brothers and sisters. According to Paul, we are living in the Spirit, because living in the flesh is what we do when we are depending on our obedience, and especially obedience to some law, to gain for us whatever reward or hope or confidence that we think we ought to have. The one thing that Jesus lacked in his flesh was sinful passions. Therefore, the law could not arouse in him acts of sin. Look down at verses, if you're still in Romans 7, look down at verses 7 and 8. Especially verse 8. But sin, seizing opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness, for apart from the law, sin is dead. So I have a craving to do the law, but I also have a craving for sin. And when I put those two cravings together, my craving for sin uses law to actually lead me into sin that I didn't intend to do at all. That's Romans 7. That's kind of a summary statement of it. It's completely different from what most of you have heard. And so it's maybe a little bit more confusing than helpful at this point. But the best I can do is to say that Jesus simply didn't have sinful passions. And so there was never any solicitation to any sinful thing in him to violate the law of God. And so that would not be, that's an area of sin Jesus never experienced, but it's an area of sin you and I experience all the time. Yet he remained completely free in respect of sin. Now, scriptural proof of Christ's impeccability. The word impeccability comes from a Latin word pecor or pecco, which means to sin. The prefix im, which would mean unable to sin, and the ability at the end is there. So his inability to sin. Number one, or A, the immutability of Christ pertains to his person, which is both human and divine, not simply to one of his natures. For him to sin and to be able to sin would implicate the divine nature in sin. This is impossible. Let me put a little flesh on that, discuss it for just a moment. I said to you that Jesus in the incarnation gave up the voluntary use of his attributes. So God does not do the same work every day. He doesn't part the Red Sea every day. He parted it once in history. He didn't part it again. He does not raise Lazarus from the dead every day. He does not. What are some of the other miracles? Not one comes to my mind. With all my great learning has driven me mad. He doesn't do the same miracles every day or even frequently. That's part of the definition of a miracle. It's infrequent. It's unexpected. It's beyond the capacity for the natural realm to produce. So God is able to do different things at different times, and he's able to use his power in different ways. Sometimes he uses his power directly, as when he raises Lazarus from the dead. Sometimes God uses his power indirectly by redirecting the created world to do his will. So to part the Red Sea, he didn't simply force the Red Sea back by the word of his power. He sent a strong wind to drive the water back. So he uses his power in different ways and at different times. God's power is subject to his will, but God's righteousness is not subject to his will. His grace is not subject to his will. His justice is not subject to his will. So he may exercise in our experience and in our observation, he may exercise his omnipotence in ways that we recognize. He must be righteous, just, and gracious in all that he does. So, and once again, we've got a microphone on. If you could turn that off, everyone check the microphone if you will, please. Yeah, we need quiet for the moment. Jesus in the incarnation cannot make a rock that's too big for him to pick up, because he cannot make a rock unless the Father wills it. Number two, he could, if the Father willed it, make a rock, but if he tried to pick it up with his human power, it would break his arm. So Jesus may exercise omnipotence. He must exercise righteousness, justice, and grace. So, third, there under, number B is what we looked at. Mutable holiness would be incompatible with the other divine attributes described to the God-man. First, it is inconsistent with his omnipotence. To be able to sin is not an ability, it's a disability. We don't realize that. We think of the word able, and when we say not able, we imply weakness, some lack in our being. But there are things that we as humans are able to do that Jesus was not able to do, which were not matters of our of our ability and his disability. They are matters of our profound weakness and his profound strength. He has a strength of will to trust the Father even in the face of the greatest possible temptations. Some of you may have been taught Maslow's hierarchy. I don't know. Again, would someone answer, have you been taught about Maslow's hierarchy? I need you to turn on your mic and let me know.
No.
Okay. There was a European scholar who was studying psychology, and he came up with a hierarchy of needs. And there are, I can't go through them, but there are 7 levels in the hierarchy. It's a pyramid, and the lowest level need must be met before, according to Maslow, the lowest level need must be met before the higher level needs can be met. And so you move from food and sustenance for life up to acceptance and honor and so forth. But you can't teach people intellectually when they are hungry physically. And so if you have someone who is suffering from malnutrition, you can't teach them calculus. That's not going to happen because, according to Maslow's hierarchy, the most base level needs must be met before you can bring them up to the other levels of the hierarchy. In the temptation, Jesus was below the 7th level, below the base level of Maslow's hierarchy. He had been fasting for 40 days. I know people who have done studies of fasting, and they indicate that at 40 days, your body has used up all of its reserves of energy, and it's now beginning to feed on the necessary material of your body. It's beginning to feed on the muscle structure. So it's used up all the fat reserves, and it's beginning to feed on muscle. And that's when people begin to hallucinate about food. So if Maslow's hierarchy were absolutely right, then Jesus could not have faced the first of the temptations that Satan gave him. Speak to these stones that they become bread. If you're the Son of God, speak to these stones that they become bread. And Jesus' answer says that Maslow's hierarchy is inadequate, it's incomplete, because there is a deeper need than food and drink. And that need is to do the will of the Father. We don't sense that because we live too much in our bodies and not enough as what we are intended to be, people of the Spirit. And I'm not here talking about asceticism at all. I'm talking here about we must learn to live in 2 worlds. We must learn to live in the world of the Spirit, as Jesus did, and in the world of the flesh, as Jesus did. Jesus knew how to live in both worlds at the same time, so that for him and for us too, it is more basic that we do the will of the Father than that we have the necessary food daily. Since he is omnipotent in his person, his will is supported by omnipotence. That the Father does for him throughout his whole life. He supports his will with omnipotence so that his will can never violate, can never deviate from the most basic of needs, and that is to do the will of the Father. And then second, under B, the success of temptation depends in part upon deceiving the person tempted. A finite intelligence may be deceived, but an infinite intelligence cannot be deceived. I would word this slightly differently in light of our previous discussion. One who knows the Father intimately as Jesus does, knows that his Father leads him into what is necessary not what is delightful, but what is necessary. What is necessary is a 40-day fast. What is necessary is to live among sinful human beings. What is necessary is that he must go to the cross to accomplish not only the will of the God, but the will of the Word, and that is the redemption of the human race. The Word has taken the human form, so he is now Son. And the Son has a true human mind with a true human will that must be subjected to the will of God. And so we go on to read, see, immutable holiness is inconceivable, irreconcilable with the fact that the God-man is the author of holiness. Unlike the first Adam, he is the fountain of spiritual and holy life, and this implies the unchangeable nature of his own holiness. Jesus cannot violate his righteousness, his justice, his grace. And because of my own conception of holiness, that entails then he cannot violate holiness. Fourth, did we do third? Yes. Fourth, conclusions from his natures. A, being God, he was not able to sin. B, being man, he was able to sin, although there was nothing in him that temptation could address, nothing analogous to our indwelling sin. C, as the God-man, he was able to overcome all temptation and able to prevent his human nature from sinning. D, Christ's person is constituted of two natures, one divine and the other human. The divine nature is intemptable and impeccable, not able to sin. The human nature, on the contrary, is both temptable and peccable, as is evident from the fact that the only other sinless beings who ever lived human life on the earth sinned. And then third, when these two natures are united in one theanthropic person, and there we come back to that term that we gave a couple of, yes, probably last week. Theos in Greek means God. Anthropos means human. So this person is a divine human person. Cannot be, so what might be done by the human nature if alone and by its, I'm sorry, number three, when these two natures are united in one theanthropic person as they are in the incarnation, the divine determines and controls the human, not the human the divine. Fourth, what might be done by the human nature if alone and by itself cannot be done by it in its union with the omnipotent holiness. However, if the properties of either nature may be attributed to the person of the God-man, why may not both peccability and impeccability be attributed to the person of the God-man? So the question is, but he's true human. Isn't true humanity able to sin? And the answer on the screen above is, well, of course. But if he's God, he's not able to sin. So what are we to say on this? So, E, however, if the properties of either nature be, why may not both peccability and impeccability be attributed to the person of the God-man? The divine nature cannot innocently and righteously leave the human nature to its own finiteness without any support from the divine, as it can in other operations of the divine person. So the divine nature, God's righteousness, is not subject to God's will. God's power is subject to God's will, but God's righteousness is not subject to God's will. So if that's the case, then the divine nature of Jesus cannot not be righteous and must sustain the human will and nature in righteousness. So A, when the Logos goes into union with a human nature so as to constitute a single person with it, he becomes responsible for all this person does through the instrumentality of the nature. Jesus is not two persons. He's not a human person and a divine person. It's essential that we go to our chart again. And as you can see here, we're dealing with the question, was he two persons? And I answered no, he was one person with two natures. So back to our chart. There are three persons in the Godhead. Yes? So I have the God, the Word, and the Spirit. Each of the persons possesses the one nature. Because of spiritual life teaching you have received, I suspect you believe that we are one person with two natures. We have a new nature and we have an old nature, or a sinful nature. If I am one person with two natures, by the way, I do not accept that concept. That language I think is flawed. But if you accept it, why cannot Jesus be one person with two natures himself, one divine and one human? As he is a divine person. But by the way, therefore, the implication of this chart is that the nature, this is so the arrow begins here in the divine nature. God is spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, will, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. The divine nature is not personal. The persons possess the divine nature. The persons have as persons no unique attributes. By the same token, when the Word takes a human nature, he takes on the attributes of a human nature. The Word may express himself through the divine nature, or he may express himself through the human nature. But in expressing himself through the human nature to the world, he expresses himself in terms that are consistent with his divine nature, but also with his human nature. So he is flesh. The divine nature is not flesh. He is finite, temporal, and changeable. We know this because of what we have seen in recent studies. We have seen Luke chapter 2. He grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. How can he grow in wisdom, he who is infinite in wisdom? Because he's a human. And he's a human teenager without sin. Now, we've never known such a creature. Some of you have teenagers in your families. You have not known a teenager without sin. We long for a day when we will find a teenager without sin, but one has lived on this earth. His name is Jesus. He is a teenager without sin, but he's a true human teenager, still only one person. He has a human will and a divine will. He has a human nature and a divine nature. He has a human mind and a divine mind. But over here in this list, his attributes are changeable. He may grow in wisdom. He may express power at some time and not at another. He cannot cease being. He may express justice in one way at one time and another in another time. But he must be holy and righteous and good all the time. So let's go back to where we were in our discussion of the impeccability of God, of Jesus. Here we go. Yes. So what I'm arguing is, and this is a long way around to get to this point, and I'm going to summarize the rest of this discussion. It gets fairly detailed and difficult. The impeccability of Christ is supported by the relation of the two wills in his person to each other. Each nature, in order to be complete, entire, and wanting nothing, has its own will. We've tried to argue that case. But the finite will never antagonizes the infinite will, but obeys it invariably and perfectly. If this should for an instant cease to be the case, there would be a conflict in the self-consciousness of Jesus Christ, similar to the conflict in the self-consciousness of his apostle Paul. So I find in myself the law that to me who wants to do the good, the evil is present, Paul says. On the contrary, number 3 at the bottom of the screen, there is the calm inquiry of Christ, which of you convinces me of sin? G, the impeccability of Christ is not inconsistent with temptability. And you can read this as we go. I want to sum this up at this point. We'll go on to the end. What are the reasons why Christ was tempted? The suffering involved in his temptation was part of his humiliation and satisfaction for sin. And in submitting to temptation, Christ sets an example for his disciples of constancy and obedience and resistance to evil. And I may add, though Shedd does not add this, an example of one who, because sin is at its heart unbelief, always trusts the Father. Even when there does not seem to be an external reason for trust, he trusts the Father. Then he gives us an example of how to live the Christian life. He lives the very life he intends us to live. And there's more here. This is very, very small print. You can look at that as you wish. Then we've asked the question and answered the question, was he two persons? What is the point of all this discussion about the peccability of Christ? Is he able to sin? As a man, he is able to sin. But because he is God, he is able not to sin because his deity is not able to sin. And the presence of that word not in two different places is very important. Adam was able not to sin, but he sinned because he still had the capacity for sin within him, the capacity to live not in dependence upon the will of God. Satan is not able not to sin. Everything Satan does is sinful. He is not able not to sin. You and I are in the position that Adam was in. We are able not to sin. Once again, definition of sin. It's critically important that you understand this. John 16, 8 and 9. The definition of sin is living in unbelief. So when I act in unbelief, I am sinning. Even if I'm obeying, I'm sinning. When I live in faith, I am able not to sin. And that means that even no matter how strong the enticement to sin is, I am able to turn it down because I am able to look to a God whose resources for sustaining my will, even in the midst of the most harrowing of temptations, the most powerful temptations, even then, I am able to overcome sin. So was he two persons? No, he was one person with two natures. So he is truly human. And we go back to our chart. Next week, and we'll stop here, we'll turn to the question, did he give up his humanity in the ascension? And then we will complete our discussions with the importance. Why is this all so important for us to talk about? So let's stop our PowerPoint and see if any questions have arisen during the course of this time we've spent together. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Allman. Hello, everyone. Please feel free to post your questions if you have any. There is one question from Brother Rohit. He cited Hebrews 9:14, and he asked from there, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God? So what does it mean that he offered through the eternal spirit?
Let me preface this by saying I have not really any solid idea. Let me explore a little bit and see what we can come up with.
Mm.
Do notice there the important comma after the word Christ in that verse. How much more will the blood of Christ, comma, who through the eternal spirit offered himself without blemish to God, comma, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. He is not offering, this is the best I can do. What you must understand, brothers and sisters, is that no matter how much study you ever do in the Word of God, you always remain a child paddling around in the edge of the beach where the water meets the beach. You're just paddling around and building little sandcastles and hoping one of them actually turns out to be something nice that you're proud of. So here I am. I started my theological studies in 1973, and I'm continuing them to this point. So I'm approaching 40 years. 2 years, I'll be 40 years in this process. Well, is that right? 50. Oh, it's even worse. 50 years. Dear me. Please pray for me. I'm older than I thought. But I'm still a child paddling around in the surf, finding a pretty stone here, finding a nice shell there, and putting them in a bag and taking them home and putting them on my shelf. So all I'm doing is paddling around as a little child, trying to understand Hebrews chapter 9:14. He did not offer sacrifices like the Old Testament priests did, animals who have no will in the matter, have no interest whatsoever in that personally, individually, in what the worshiper is doing, except the pain that they undergo in the slaughtering process. Those are offered on a tangible altar by a physical high priest who is nothing but physical, and he may not even be righteous, he may not even be godly. The sacrifice properly made on the altar by Eli, or Eli, perhaps you pronounce his name, was as atoning as the sacrifice made on the altar by one of his sons. I don't know how you pronounce their names. Hophni and Phineas is what we do in American English. But if it was properly made on the altar, even by the wicked men, Hophni and Phineas, it was still atoning. But this is no sacrifice that Jesus makes. It is not made on an earthly altar, made of anything earthly. It is not made by a mere human high priest. It is not, or even any human priest, mere human priest. Indeed, as Hebrews 7 says, and as we will see next week or in the next 2 weeks, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest. So his priesthood has to function in heaven. The essential, we really misunderstand much of what's going on in the sacrificial ritual, because we focus on what the scriptures focus on, namely all that you do in manipulating the animal and how you prepare the animal for sacrifice and so forth. But we miss the fact that for many of the sacrifices, blood is taken inside the tabernacle and applied inside the tabernacle, according to Exodus and Leviticus, so that the real functioning of the priest is not on the altar. The real functioning of the priest is in the tabernacle, but as Hebrews makes the point, that was a physical tabernacle. Jesus is in the real tabernacle, of which the one in the wilderness was only a model. Jesus doesn't function in the models. He functions in the realities. And so his sacrifice may well be what we read in Romans chapter 8. That is, the offering of his sacrifice may well be what we read in Romans chapter 8. Turn there. When the priest took the sacrifice into the tabernacle, he, especially when he took the blood into the tabernacle, if it was not Day of Atonement, he applied the blood to the horns of the altar, and then he took coals from the altar and put them on the altar of incense, and put incense on them, and the smoke of the incense would rise in the tabernacle. The implications of that, certainly in Revelation, we find this imagery. The incense are the prayers of the saints. So the incense is probably an indication of the priest praying in the tabernacle. And I find the same passage, same concept going on in Romans chapter 8. Verse 34. Who is to condemn? It is Jesus Christ who died, yes, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed intercedes for us. It's at the right hand of God. Turn to Hebrews. Oh, let me see if I can come up with the passage. It's got to be chapter 7. Here it is. I thought this Bible had Hebrews in a different place. I have some Bibles that have Hebrews in a different place. We'll come back to this in the next 2 weeks, but looking in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1. Now the main point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens. And how many times have you heard somebody say, no priest ever sat down in the tabernacle or temple? There were no seats because there was no time for the job, for the work to be done. Jesus' work is done. He's seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and the true tent that the Lord and not any mortal has set up. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Hence, it's necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. So the sacrifice of Jesus is not made when he's on the cross. The sacrifice of Jesus is made when he goes to be with his Father. So, now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They offer worship in a sanctuary that is a sketch and shadow of the heavenly one. For Moses, when he was about to erect the tent, was warned, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. But Jesus has now obtained a more excellent ministry, and to that degree, he is a mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted through better promises. And he goes on in chapter 9, he comes back to the high priesthood of Jesus in verse 11. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place, not with the blood of goats and bulls, but with his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls, with the sprinkling of the ashes of a heifer, sanctifies those who have been defiled so that their flesh is purified, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to worship the living God? The large issue here is, folks, that the Old Testament sacrifices, and if we went on, we could do this more in detail in Hebrews chapter 10, the old sacrifices could never take away sins. Jesus takes away sin. So he does it through the eternal Spirit. In that respect, that he is operating now not merely as a man, but once again manifesting himself in his full deity. And when one person acts, we talked about this at the very beginning, when in the ontological Trinity, when the one person acts, the whole of the divine nature acts, so that the other two persons are involved as well in the action. So Acts 20:28, watch out for yourselves and all the flock over whom the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the flock of God, which he purchased with his own blood. So I've got God the Son, God the Father, and God the Spirit all together in one verse, but also in Hebrews chapters 8, 9, and 10, he offers himself without blemish through the through the eternal Spirit. So that's the best I can do with it. And I don't know whether I'm even on target or not. I'm sorry, Brother Rohit, for that, but I do the best I can.
Wow. Brother John, you wanted to ask some question.
Yes.
Would you? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Dr. Allman, you were talking about Jesus when he was on this earth. He was not omnipotent.
Yes.
Uh,
Well,
uh,
I'd rather say it differently, but go ahead.
okay. So in John chapter 2, when Nathaniel comes to meet him, he says, I saw you sitting under the fig tree. And so he was omniscient. And even in John chapter, that was John chapter 1. And in John chapter 2, he says, it is written like this. He knew all people and needed no one to witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. And in many places, it is written that he knew what they were thinking. So, isn't this talking about the omniscience of of Jesus as a man?
If it is, then it's contradicting John 5 and John 7. So if in John 5 he says the Son cannot do anything on his own, only what he sees the Father. In fact, he doesn't even say anything on his own. Only what he hears the Father say is what he says. So
Okay, so you're saying that his knowing what was where Nathaniel was revealed by the Spirit to him.
yes,
Uh,
yes,
okay, I got it. Okay.
yeah. So we latch on to those kinds of verses, and rightly. God gave them to us. We latch on to them and want to understand the person of Jesus entirely on those bases, but we don't like those others. Matthew 26 or 24, he doesn't know the day of his return. He cannot do anything on his own. He sits down at the well at Sychar because he's weary. We don't factor those into our thinking about who this person is. He's a unique person in history, and he's hard for us to grasp. So we've got to take all the data and put it together. So thank you, Brother John, for asking that. That's good. No doubt others were thinking about it too.
Thank you.
There is another question. Would it be correct to conclude that human beings or flesh is synonymous with sin? Because the Bible contends that there is none without sin and has fallen short.
Yeah. If so, again, there's a contradiction with Jesus because he came in the flesh. So we have to face the reality that all words in all languages have different senses, and I have to let the immediate context define the sense. I don't know your languages at all. I don't even know for sure what most of you speak. I suspect many of you speak Telugu, but there may be some Tamils who've crept in unawares to the meetings, and others. But this is the way language works. You use a word for more than one sense, and because of that, if I try to force one sense into every occurrence of the word, I will really make a mess out of everything I'm trying to communicate. So nobody will understand me, and I won't understand anybody else. So Jesus comes in flesh. He shares this physical substance with us. But that's not the same as what Paul is talking about in flesh in Romans chapter 7. So it's a different sense of the word. I see it's 11 o'clock here by my clock. The hour and a half that we've allotted for our time has elapsed.
Yeah.
Brother Timothy, do you want to call on somebody to pray? And then we'll...
Yes. I think we don't have questions also.
Okay.
More. So we can probably stop here. May I request Jonathan Steeds, Brother Jonathan Steeds, if you are able, can you pray and conclude the session?
Right, yes, certainly, Timothy, thank you. Let us pray, everybody. Our Father, we come to the end of this time